Okay, thanks, Barry. So as Barry said, I'm going to talk a little bit about prototyping, what it is and why you might find it useful to test a new idea or a new project that you have in mind. So what is prototyping? So I suppose the title is a little bit deliberately provocative. We're not saying that there isn't a place for pilots to test things in healthcare. Obviously there is, and sometimes you might need to do a pilot to do a full proof of concept, maybe collect data around patient outcomes and experience. But the restrictions around pilots is sometimes they do require extra cost, extra resources, extra time. And because we've invested that time into the process, sometimes it can be difficult to tweak. We can get quite attached to the process. And at the end of a pilot, sometimes the only alternative is to either continue it or to disband it completely. And that's not a good use of our time and resources. And sometimes piloting is quite place restricted, so it's not always very portable, and sometimes it's difficult to move it to different settings and different patient cohorts. So an alternative might be to think about prototyping, and if you think about what prototyping and what it is, you might think of examples from the design world, and you know that's a lot of what we're drawing on is coming from that space. So this is some of the prototypes that went into making up the final version of the Dyson Hoover that a lot of people will be familiar with. And repeatedly there was over 5,000 versions of that that Hoover modeled up before they came up with their final version. So it's really what a prototype is a way to build a representation of one of your idea to show to other people. And it's a concept that comes from design thinking, which is a methodology that we're using a lot across CHI. We're using it less in the product space and more when we're thinking about how we're designing our processes, both for the new hospital, but also in terms of between now and then and how we get there. So prototyping is essentially a preliminary version of your final idea. So it's something that's mocked up, that sells the idea sells your idea, communicates your idea, and it's easy to test, quick to build. And it's often a very lo-fi version that you can mock up quite easily and before you get to your final version. So some examples of how we've used prototypes in CHI. One idea is around models or visual representation. So these are some of the examples of from groups and teams that we've worked with in CHI. On the left there, that's hot off the press from a workshop we did yesterday with the general pediatric team. One of the ideas they came up with was around giving information to patients and parents about their stay and the ward. And they came up with this model, this Lego model of a tablet. And it was a nice idea because it communicated some of the ideas on that they had for that tablet and app. But also, if you're testing with children, they could add to it using Lego, and it was a nice way to get your idea across and test things. Similarly, in the middle there was a mocked-up version, a group looking at food choices on the wards, developed a model of a vending machine, menus, swipe cards. And on the right there, that was a swipeable wearable device for children that they could use to access information about their healthcare. This was a group that were looking at space in their ward, and they were looking at a staff room and how to reconfigure it for a lot of different uses. So they mocked it up using paper and cardboard. There was kind of movable elements to the model, and they were testing it with other colleagues here. You could see that people were quite engaged and interested in what they were doing. So it really made their idea visible, and they were able to get good feedback on that. And this is what that might look like in a larger scale. So this is the Adelaide Women and Children's Hospital in Australia. And before they built their hospital, they mocked up large scale rooms. Now, this is beyond certainly my model making abilities, but you can see how something like this would be a lot easier and cheaper to knock down walls and make adjustments before you get to your final version. So in our new hospital, we have our own version of prototyping as well. We have a mock-up room that's been built adjacent to the offices in Herberton, opposite the new hospital bill site. And that allows patients and staff and parents to come in and trial out different elements in the new room, and they've made some adjustments to the final versions based on that mock-up. And then also for a long time, all we had in the new hospital to visualize it was pictures, and then this wooden model, some of you might have seen, it was reeled around the hospitals, and at the moment it's sitting in the Herberton offices under a glass case. And this is the final version. So you can see how a model of that type really gives you a sense of what the final version is going to look like, and it really communicates and sells the idea behind it. So if your idea or project is more based around a process than a product, and that's a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment. Some of the ways you can prototype are around storyboarding and mapping. A lot of people will be very familiar with the concept of process mapping or process flows, where you make each step on the process very visible using paper models or using software. And then you can bring it around and test it, look to see where the duplication in your process is, where the waste is, the delays. And similarly with storyboarding, it's quite similar. It's a bit more visual, and often it's used more in terms of mapping out the experience for patients and families as they go through the journey. So what each scene in that journey, what's that look like? And it just helps to bring that a little bit to life. Other ways that you can start to test your processes before you implement them is through simulation or role play. So I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea of clinical simulation, and you know, this is quite similar in a prototyping sense. So you're running through a process, you're literally role playing, acting out, simulating that process. You're getting a sense of what it feels like for each of the team members there. It is definitely about learning, but it's also just testing and tweaking as you go along. So typically you run through a process, then you might run it again and stop at different points and get feedback and comments from the people observing. But also it can be useful to think about not just the clinical event itself, but what happens before and after the patient comes into the room. How do they come in? What happens after they leave the room? And then what is the role for non-clinical staff and that, porters, ward clerks, reception staff, cleaning staff, and then importantly, what's the experience for patients and family members? And an experience I had in my previous role in Beaumont, I ran a simulation for the cardiac team who were opening a new cardiac cath lab, and they wanted to just test out a process before they opened the new lab. So we did a full simulation running through a process, but instead of having a dummy on the trolley, a member of the staff took on the role of a patient. And at different points during the process, we checked in with that staff member to say, how does this feel? What's going on now for you lying on that trolley? So it gave them some really valuable insight in terms of the patient experience. And from that, they made quite significant changes to their processes, including having a staff member greeting the patient before they came in, staying beside the top of the trolley with them, talking to the patient while the procedure is going on, and going through with them to recovery. This is a group of staff that are doing, and it's not a clinical simulation, it's a virtual clinic that they're mocking up. And again, they were having a bit of fun of it here, but the people watching were able to give comments, suggestions, and it was a good way to test and get their ideas across. So ultimately, the benefits of prototyping is it helps you communicate your idea. It makes it really visual and tangible, so people really get a sense of what your idea is. It allows you to really quickly test and adapt your idea. So because you're doing something that's quite low cost and doesn't take a lot of resources to do, you can change things quite quickly. It can help you spark new ideas, and you might develop a number of different prototypes and keep testing as you go along. Hopefully not as many as Dyson had to do. It's often very portable and allows you to test in different environments and different patient cohorts, and that can be important to test. Is this something that's just going to work in one area, or is it going to work across multiple different areas or multiple groups of patients? And then there's something about the psychological contract as well. If you've got a low fidelity version of something that's, you know, something mocked up a card or something mapped out in a piece of paper, it's much easier to give feedback than a process that's already piloted, implemented. Sometimes by the time you get to a pilot, your process is all neatly wrapped up in a bow, and to give feedback, it feels like you have to pull at the end of the ribbon and everything unravels. So it can be difficult to be open and honest about giving your feedback, also to receive that feedback if you're very invested in the pilot and what's happened. So there's something about just it's easier to get feedback and receive it as well. And it allows you then to move forward to implement, or potentially you might want to go into a pilot after a prototyping stage, if you want to further test your proof of concept. But you're doing that with minimal use of time and resources and cost.